The maestro was walking hurriedly when suddenly the sound of a violin made him stop. That music. It was impossible. The young girl was playing the same melody he had taught his daughter, the daughter who disappeared years ago. At that moment, everything around him vanished. And what happened next will make you cry. The rain drummed against the tall windows of Lincoln Center like a restless heart, each drop catching the amber glow of the streetlights below. Richard Whitman stood at his office window, watching the late evening traffic blur into streaks of red and white, his reflection ghosting over the scene like a man caught between two worlds. At 57, Richard commanded respect. Wherever classical music mattered, the New York Times had called him a maestro whose baton doesn't just conduct orchestras, it conducts souls. Tonight, however, that same baton lay forgotten on his mahogany desk, next to a half-empty cup of coffee that had grown cold hours ago. His fingers traced the familiar scar on his left hand, a thin line from his wedding ring to his knuckle, earned 23 years ago when he'd frantically torn through the metal barriers at Central Park, screaming his daughter's name until his voice gave out. The scar had faded to silver, but the memory remained razor-sharp. Emily would have been 26 today. Richard closed his eyes and let the weight of that impossible math settle in his chest. 26. Old enough to have finished college, maybe graduate school. Old enough to be married, to have given him grandchildren he'd never meet. Old enough to have forgiven him for the choice that destroyed everything. The choice, even now. The word tasted like ashes in his mouth. Mr. Whitman. His assistant's voice drifted through the intercom. The car's here for your radio show. Tell them 5 minutes, Sarah. Richard straightened his tie, a nervous habit that had developed in the years after Emily's disappearance. Every Tuesday at 11 p.m., he made the same journey across town to a small radio station in Queens, where he hosted a show called Midnight Melodies. Most people assumed it was just another classical music program, but Richard knew better. It was his lifeline to a ghost. The studio was cramped and smelled faintly of stale coffee and old carpet. Marcus, the night engineer, was barely 25, younger than Emily would be now, and he treated Richard with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for broken things. "We're live in 60 seconds, Mr. Whitman." Richard slipped on his headphones and stared at the microphone that had become his confessional. For 23 years, every Tuesday night, he'd played the same song, a lullaby he'd composed when his wife Sarah was pregnant, when the future stretched before them like an endless symphony of possibility. "Good evening, New York. This is Richard Whitman with Midnight Melodies, tonight. Like every Tuesday night, we begin with something special, a piece I wrote many years ago for someone very dear to me." His fingers found the familiar keys of the studio's old upright piano. The melody emerged soft and haunting, a lullaby that spoke of love so pure it could survive anything, even loss. He'd never published Lullaby for My Star, never shared the sheet music. It existed only in these moments, floating through the airwaves like a message in a bottle cast into an endless ocean. "This song," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was written for my daughter, Emily. She'd be 26 today." He didn't usually talk about Emily on the air, just played the song and moved on. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the anniversary of her birth, the words came easier. "You know, people ask me why I keep playing the same song week after week. They think it's morbid, maybe even unhealthy. But here's the thing about music. It's not bound by the same rules as everything else. A song can travel farther than any voice, reach places we can't go, touch hearts we've never met." The melody swelled, and Richard closed his eyes, remembering Emily at 3 years old, clapping her tiny hands as he played. She'd had his dark hair, but her mother's green eyes, and when she laughed, it sounded like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "I play this song because somewhere out there, in this vast, impossible world, I believe music can do what nothing else can. I believe it can find its way home." The song ended, and Richard sat in the familiar silence that followed. Somewhere in the city, late-night listeners were probably switching stations, looking for something more upbeat. But a few, maybe just a handful, would understand. They'd know what it meant to love someone so much that you'd spend decades calling their name into the darkness, hoping for an echo. After the show, Richard walked the 15 blocks back to his apartment instead of taking the car. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the city hummed with its midnight energy. Sirens in the distance, the occasional burst of laughter from a late-night diner, the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. His apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a successful conductor living alone. Tasteful, organized, and heartbreakingly quiet, photos of Emily filled the mantelpiece. Emily as a baby, Emily taking her first steps, Emily on her 3rd birthday just 2 weeks before she vanished. He'd stopped taking pictures after that. Couldn't see the point in capturing time when time had become his enemy. The piano in his living room was a Steinway Grand, the same model he'd played when he proposed to Sarah 28 years ago. These days, it served mainly as a piece of expensive furniture. He couldn't bring himself to play Lullaby for My Star anywhere but the radio station. Here, in the space where Emily had once danced to his music, the silence felt sacred. Richard poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and settled into his leather armchair, the same one where he used to read Emily bedtime stories. The police files sat in a cabinet across the room. 23 years of false leads, dead ends, and heartbreak organized chronologically. He'd stopped reading them 5 years ago, but he couldn't bring himself to throw them away. Detective Morrison had retired in 2018, but not before passing the case to a younger officer who called Richard every few months with updates that always led nowhere. "Still working it, Mr. Whitman," she'd say. And Richard would thank her, knowing they both understood the truth. After 23 years, Emily Whitman was a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a cold case that would probably never warm up again. But Richard knew something the police didn't. He knew that love doesn't follow the same rules as evidence. Love doesn't have a statute of limitations. And sometimes, just sometimes, love finds a way to bend the impossible into the possible. He raised his glass to the photo on the side table. Emily at 18 months. Flour in her hair from helping her mother bake cookies, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that could light up galaxies. "Happy birthday, Star," he whispered. "Wherever you are, I hope you can hear the music." Outside, the city dreamed its restless dreams. And somewhere in those dreams, Richard believed, a melody was traveling through the darkness, searching for the heart that had always been its home. The violin case was soaked through by the time Madison Cooper ducked under the awning of Lou's Diner on State Street. Chicago's October rain had a way of cutting straight through to your bones, and after 4 hours of playing on the corner of Jackson and LaSalle, her fingers were numb, and her case held barely enough to cover tomorrow's coffee. She shook the water from her dark hair and checked her phone. 11:47 p.m. Margaret would be pacing by now, probably standing at the kitchen window with that worried crease between her eyebrows that had deepened over the years. Madison could picture her exactly. Gray hair in curlers, wearing the faded blue robe that had seen better decades, clutching her tea mug like a lifeline. "You're late, honey." The voice on the other end of the phone carried 26 years of motherly concern, wrapped in a Chicago accent that had never quite faded, despite Margaret's efforts to sound more refined. "I know, Mom. Sorry. The rain scared most people underground, but I managed to catch a few late commuters." Madison tucked the phone between her shoulder and ear while she counted the damp bills in her case. $43 and change. Not great, but enough for groceries tomorrow. "I'm heading home now. Did you eat dinner?" Madison smiled despite her exhaustion. Some things never changed. Margaret Doyle had been asking the same question every night since Madison could remember, and the answer was usually the same. "I grabbed a sandwich earlier." "That's not dinner." Madison rose. "A sandwich is not dinner." Madison rose. Margaret only used her middle name when she was worried or frustrated. Tonight, it sounded like both. Madison had been named after her birth mother, a beautiful musician who died giving birth to her. According to the story Margaret had told her since childhood, a story that felt both perfectly real and strangely hollow, like a song with missing notes. The train ride back to Lincoln Park took 40 minutes, and Madison spent it the way she always did, watching her reflection in the dark window while her mind wandered to places she couldn't quite name. Sometimes, especially when she was tired, she'd catch herself humming a melody that felt ancient and familiar, like something she'd known before she was born. Tonight, the melody was particularly strong. It started soft, almost like a lullaby, but as the train swayed through the tunnel, it grew more complex, building layers of harmony that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. By the time she reached her stop, Madison was humming variations she'd never consciously composed, her fingers moving against her violin case as if they were finding notes on invisible strings. The apartment she shared with Margaret was on the second floor of a converted brownstone. The kind of place that had probably been elegant once but now wore its age like comfortable old clothes. The stairs creaked in all the familiar places, and Madison could smell Margaret's chamomile tea before she even reached the landing. "There's my girl." Margaret appeared in the doorway before Madison could fish out her keys. And for a moment, Madison saw something flicker across her adoptive mother's face. Relief, mixed with something else. Something almost like fear. "Come on, let me make you some real food." Margaret Doyle had always been what people called sturdy. Broad shoulders, capable hands, and a face that spoke of kindness earned through hardship. At 68, she moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades caring for others, first as a nurse, and now as Madison's devoted guardian. But tonight, Madison noticed the way Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she heated up leftover soup, and the way her eyes kept darting to the window as if she expected to see something troubling in the darkness outside. "Everything okay, Mom?" "Of course, honey, just tired. Mrs. Patterson next door mentioned she saw you talking to some man downtown earlier. Said he looked well-dressed, expensive." Madison paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth. She'd busked on that corner dozens of times, and barely anyone gave her more than a passing glance, let alone stop to chat. "I don't remember talking to anyone specific, just the usual. People dropping change, a few compliments about the music." Margaret's shoulders relaxed, but Madison caught the way she gripped her tea mug a little tighter. "You know how I worry about strangers in the city. There are all kinds of people out there, not all of them good." It was an old conversation, one they'd had countless times over the years. Margaret had always been protective, some might say overprotective, but it came from love. Madison knew that. Still, sometimes she felt like a bird in a cage, even if the cage was built from the best intentions. After dinner, Madison retreated to her small bedroom and unpacked her violin. The instrument was beautiful, a 1920s German piece that Margaret had somehow managed to buy for her 16th birthday. Despite their tight budget, Madison had never asked how a retired nurse could afford something so expensive. And Margaret had brushed off her questions with vague mentions of savings and sacrifice. She resigned her bow and started with scales, warming up her fingers and her instrument. But soon, inevitably, she found herself playing that melody again, the one that had been haunting her on the train. It flowed from her violin like water, each note finding its place in a pattern that felt both new and ancient. As she played, something strange happened. The melody seemed to unlock something in her mind, and suddenly she was seeing flashes of, what? Memories, dreams. A man with graying hair sitting at a grand piano, his hands moving over the keys with gentle precision. A large room with high ceilings and warm light, the scent of coffee and sheet music scattered across a polished surface. Madison stopped playing abruptly, her heart racing. These weren't new visions. They'd been coming to her in dreams for years, always featuring the same man, the same piano, the same feeling of profound loss mixed with overwhelming love. Margaret insisted they were just dreams, maybe inspired by movies or books, but they felt real in a way that made Madison's chest ache with inexplicable longing. She set down her violin and pulled out her sketchbook, a habit she'd developed as a teenager when the dreams first started. Page after page showed the same images. A man at a piano, always in profile, always with that expression of concentrated sadness, a grand staircase with intricate woodwork, a kitchen with yellow walls and morning light streaming through large windows, and always, that house. A brick colonial with white shutters and a garden full of roses. Margaret said the drawings were just Madison's artistic imagination, but sometimes Madison caught her mother looking at the sketches with an expression that seemed almost fearful, as if the drawings might somehow come to life and steal away the daughter she'd raised. The rain was still falling when Madison finally turned out her light, but softer now, a gentle percussion against her window. She closed her eyes and let the melody play in her mind, following it deeper into sleep where the man at the piano waited for her, as he did every night, his fingers creating music that felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. In the room next door, Margaret Doyle sat awake in her armchair, listening to the sounds of her daughter settling into sleep. She'd been having trouble sleeping lately. ever since that article in the Tribune about the anniversary of some missing child case. 23 years, the article had said. 23 years since little Emily Whitman had vanished from Central Park during her father's concert. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to push away the memories that threatened to surface whenever she let her guard down. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. Some loves were too dangerous to examine too closely. And some melodies, she was beginning to fear, were strong enough to travel across decades and call their singers home. The Chicago Symphony rehearsal had run long, as they always did when Richard was guest conducting. He'd spent 3 hours drilling the string section on Brahms's Fourth, pushing them toward the kind of precision that separated good orchestras from great ones. Now, at nearly 6 o'clock, the October afternoon was fading into evening, and the streets around Symphony Center buzzed with the familiar rhythm of a city shifting gears. Richard walked slowly, in no hurry to return to his hotel room, where room service, dinner, and Cian waited. Chicago had always been one of his favorite cities to visit. Something about the way the architecture reached toward the sky with such defiant optimism, the way the lake stretched out like an inland sea, endless and mysterious. He was thinking about Emily, as he often did when he traveled. She would have loved Chicago. As a 3-year-old, she'd been fascinated by tall buildings, craning her neck back until she almost fell over, pointing at the tops of skyscrapers and asking if people lived up there with the clouds. The memory was so vivid he could almost hear her voice, that sweet babble of childhood wonder that had made every ordinary moment feel magical. The rain started as a whisper, the kind of autumn drizzle that barely registered until your jacket was damp and your hair was curling at the edges. Richard ducked under the awning of a coffee shop and was reaching for his phone to call an Uber when he heard it. The melody stopped him cold. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, a cruel joke from a brain that had spent 23 years searching for ghosts in every song, every laugh, every unexpected moment of beauty. But no, there it was again, floating through the evening air like smoke, like memory made audible. Lullaby for my star. But not as he'd written it. This version was more complex, layered with variations he'd never imagined. The melody he'd composed as a simple lullaby had grown, evolved, become something richer and more heartbreaking than its original form. It was being played on a violin, and played beautifully, with a technique that spoke of years of training, and a soul that understood the music's deeper meaning. Richard's legs moved without conscious direction, following the sound through the light rain. His heart hammered against his ribs as he turned the corner and saw her. She was young, mid-20s. Maybe, with dark hair that the drizzle had turned to loose curls around her face. Her violin case lay open at her feet, scattered with bills and coins. But she played as if money was the furthest thing from her mind. Her eyes were closed, her whole body swaying with the music, and on her face was an expression of such profound longing that Richard felt his breath catch. She was playing his song, his secret song, the melody that existed nowhere but in his heart, and on those late-night radio broadcasts. Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, people streaming around him like water around a stone. A businessman bumped his shoulder, muttering an apology, but Richard barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to this moment, this impossible moment, when the universe seemed to bend in on itself. The girl, the young woman, opened her eyes as she reached the song's crescendo, and for a split second, her gaze met his across the busy street. Something flickered in her expression, a recognition that didn't quite make sense. Before she looked away and brought the song to its haunting conclusion, Richard's hands were shaking as he crossed the street. People honked at him. He'd apparently walked against the light, but he couldn't bring himself to care. 23 years of searching, of hoping, of playing that melody into the void. And here it was, being played by a stranger who somehow knew every note. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion he was trying desperately to contain. "That song, where did you learn it?" The young woman looked up at him warily, her violin still raised, bow poised as if she might need to defend herself. Up close, Richard could see that her eyes were green, not the pale green of his own, but the deep forest green of Sarah's, his late wife's eyes in a stranger's face. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice carried just a hint of Chicago in its vowels. "The melody you were just playing, Lullaby for My Star, where did you learn it?" She frowned, lowering her violin. I don't know any song by that name. I was just playing something that came to me, something that came to you. Richard stepped closer, and he saw her tense. He forced himself to take a breath, to speak more calmly. I'm sorry. I don't mean to frighten you. It's just that melody is very special to me, very personal. I wrote it, you see, and I've never shared it with anyone, not publicly. The girl, she had to be a young woman, really, probably older than she looked, studied his face with an expression that seemed caught between suspicion and something else. Something that might have been recognition. You wrote it, she asked softly. Yes, 26 years ago for my... Richard's voice broke slightly. For my daughter. Something changed in her expression then. The wariness was still there, but underneath it was a vulnerability that made her look even younger. I dream about it sometimes, she said. So quietly he had to lean in to hear her. The melody, I've been dreaming about it for years. Sometimes there's a man playing piano and he's... She stopped, shaking her head. This is crazy. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Richard's heart was beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. What does he look like in your dreams? She hesitated, then said, older, gray hair, sad eyes. He's always sitting at this beautiful grand piano, and he plays the same melody over and over, like he's trying to call someone home. The world tilted. Richard gripped the nearest lamppost to steady himself. What's your name? Madison? Madison Cooper? Not Emily. Of course not Emily. That would have been too simple, too neat. But Madison Cooper with her mother's eyes and her father's musical soul, standing in the rain playing a song that shouldn't exist anywhere but in his memory. Madison, he repeated. Tasting the name. How old are you? 26. The answer came automatically. Then her eyes widened as if she'd realized the significance. Why are you asking me these questions? Because, Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. My daughter would be 26. My daughter who disappeared 23 years ago. My daughter who used to fall asleep to that lullaby every night. Madison took a step back, bumping into her violin case. That's impossible, my mother. My adoptive mother. She raised me from a baby. She told me my birth mother died in childbirth. I don't. But even as she spoke, her voice was losing conviction. There's a music store, Richard said, gesturing down the street with a hand that shook despite his efforts to control it. Steinway and Sons. They have a piano in the window, would you? Could I play something for you? The complete version? Madison stared at him for a long moment, rain dripping from her hair, her violin hanging loose in her grip. Around them, the city continued its evening dance. Cars honking, people hurrying past with umbrellas, the distant sound of a train. But in the space between them, everything was perfectly still. Okay, she said finally, but just for a minute. And then I need to go home. The piano in Steinway and Sons was a concert grand, polished to mirror brightness. The elderly salesman was initially reluctant to let a stranger play it, but something about Richard's bearing, or perhaps the desperate intensity in his eyes, made him nod and step back. Richard's fingers found the keys like they were coming home. The melody began soft and simple, the way he'd originally written it, but as it progressed, he let it grow, adding the harmonies he'd developed over 23 years of lonely Tuesday nights. The music filled the small showroom, spilling out onto the street where Madison stood frozen in the doorway. She was crying before the first verse ended, tears streaming down her face as her body swayed to music that her mind didn't recognize, but her heart knew by heart. When Richard reached the bridge, the section he'd added when Sarah was 7 months pregnant, imagining their daughter's future, Madison's knees buckled, and she had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling. The song ended in silence, broken only by the sound of Madison's quiet sobs and the rain against the windows. Richard turned on the piano bench, his own eyes wet, and looked at the young woman who might, impossibly, miraculously, be his daughter. I know this sounds insane, he said softly, but would you be willing to talk? Really talk, because I think we have a lot to figure out. Madison wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded, not trusting her voice. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean and carrying with it the first whispers of a truth that would change everything. The coffee shop on Michigan Avenue was nearly empty at 8 p.m. Just a few students hunched over laptops and a businessman finishing a late dinner. Madison sat across from Richard in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She couldn't stop staring at his hands. Long fingers, a thin scar across the knuckles, the way they moved when he talked as if he were still conducting music. "Tell me about your earliest memory," Richard said gently. He'd been careful not to push too hard, sensing that Madison was balanced on a knife's edge between curiosity and the urge to flee. Madison closed her eyes, reaching back through the fog of childhood. "I remember being in a car for a long time. I was maybe 3, maybe 4. My mom, Margaret, she was driving, and I was in the back seat. I kept asking when we were going home, and she kept saying we were going to our new home, a better home. Do you remember where you were before the car ride? Fragments, pieces that don't quite fit together." Madison's voice was barely above a whisper. "A big house with a red door, a kitchen with yellow walls and these huge windows, and music. There was always music playing somewhere in the house." Richard's breath caught. The house in Westchester had yellow kitchen walls. Sarah had insisted on that particular shade. Sunshine morning, she'd called it. What kind of music? Classical, mostly, but also... Madison hesitated, then continued. "Someone playing piano. Always the same person. Because I remember thinking the hands looked like spider legs moving across the keys. Big hands, gentle hands." She looked up at Richard's hands again, and he saw recognition flickering in her green eyes. "Margaret said my birth mother was a musician," Madison continued, "that she died giving birth to me, and that's why I was drawn to music. But sometimes I wonder..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "What do you wonder? If that's true, why don't I remember her? I mean, if she died when I was born, there should be no memories at all. But I do remember things. A woman's voice singing lullabies, the smell of perfume when someone tucked me in at night, and the hands at the piano were definitely a man's hands." Richard felt like he was drowning in hope and terror simultaneously. Every detail Madison shared aligned with fragments of Emily's life. But he'd been down this road before. Over the years, he'd investigated dozens of young women who might have been Emily. Each time, the hope had been devastating when it proved false. "Madison," he said carefully, "would you be willing to let me run some tests? DNA, maybe, just to be sure." Her eyes widened with something that looked like panic. "I can't. I'd have to tell Margaret, and she..." Madison stopped, biting her lip. "She worries about me. A lot. If I came home and told her I'd met a strange man who thinks I might be his missing daughter, she'd probably have a heart attack. What if we kept it between us for now? Just until we know more?" Madison was quiet for a long moment, turning her tea mug in circles on the table. "Can I ask you something? If I really am your daughter, why don't I remember you? I remember fragments of everything else. But not a father." The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd wondered the same thing countless times over the years. "Trauma can affect memory in strange ways," he said softly. "And you were so young, but also..." He paused, the old guilt rising in his throat like bile. "I traveled a lot when you were little. Too much. Your mother used to say I was married to my music first and my family second, maybe. Maybe you don't remember me because I wasn't around enough to remember." The honesty in his voice seemed to surprise Madison. She studied his face, looking for deception and apparently finding none. "The dreams," she said suddenly. "They've been getting stronger lately, more detailed last week. I dreamed about a dog, a golden retriever who used to sleep at the foot of my bed. And there was this music box that played." She hummed a few bars of a melody Richard didn't recognize. "We never had a music box," Richard said, his heart sinking slightly. "But we did have a dog," Madison continued. "In the dream, anyway. His name was Mozart." Richard's coffee mug slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the table and splashing dark liquid across the surface. Madison jumped, reaching for napkins, but Richard barely noticed the spill. "What did you say?" "I said we had a dog, in the dream, named Mozart." "Mozart was real," Richard whispered. "He was Emily's dog, a golden retriever we adopted when she was 2. He died about 6 months before she..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Madison had gone very still. napkins clutched in her hands, staring at Richard with an expression of dawning terror and hope. That's not possible. The music box was real too. It was in Emily's room. Your room, it played for Elise. Your mother bought it at an antique shop in Connecticut. Stop! Madison's voice was sharp, panicked. Just stop. This is crazy. I can't. Margaret raised me. She's my mother. She loves me. She would never... But her voice was breaking, and Richard could see the cracks forming in the story she'd built her life around. Across town, Margaret Doyle stood at her kitchen window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Madison should have been home by now. She was never this late without calling, especially not in weather like this. Margaret's hands shook as she dialed Madison's number for the third time in an hour. It went straight to voicemail again, and Margaret hung up without leaving a message. She'd already left too. The newspaper lay open on her kitchen table, folded to the arts section, where a small article announced the Chicago Symphony's guest conductor for the week, Richard Whitman. Even seeing the name in print made Margaret's chest tight with old panic. She'd known this day would come eventually, had planned for it, prepared for it, dreaded it for 23 years. But knowing something and living through it were two different things entirely. Margaret walked to the bedroom that had been Madison's since she was 3 years old. The walls were covered with sketches, dozens of them, accumulated over more than a decade, always the same subjects: a man at a piano, a grand staircase, a house with a red door and white shutters. Madison called them dreams, but Margaret knew better. They were memories, surfacing despite all her efforts to keep them buried, in the bottom drawer of Madison's dresser, wrapped in tissue paper and hidden beneath old sweaters. Margaret kept the one thing she'd never been able to bring herself to destroy: a small silver bracelet with a heart-shaped charm engraved with the name Emily. She'd taken it off the child's wrist that day in Central Park, meaning to throw it away, but somehow she never could. It was proof of what she'd done, but it was also proof of the love that had driven her to do it, the love that had saved them both. In its way, Margaret closed the drawer and returned to the kitchen, where she made herself another cup of tea with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the city, her daughter, her Emily, her Madison, was probably learning truths that would destroy the only family either of them had known for more than 2 decades. Back in the coffee shop, Madison was staring at Richard with eyes that seemed too large for her face. "If what you're saying is true," she said slowly, "then everything I know about my life is a lie." "Not everything," Richard said gently. "Margaret raised you. She loved you. That's real, no matter how it started. But she stole me." The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if Madison was testing how they sounded. "If you're right, she stole me from my real parents. From me," Richard corrected softly. "Your mother, your birth mother, died when you were 4. Cancer. Margaret would have taken you from a single father who was never home, who cared more about his career than his daughter." Madison stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. "I need to go. This is too much. I need to think." "Madison, wait." Richard stood as well, reaching into his jacket. "Here's my card. My hotel information is on the back, when you're ready to talk more. If you're ready, please call me." She took the card without looking at it, shoving it into her jacket pocket. "I can't promise anything." "I know, but Madison," she turned back to him at the door, "that melody you were playing today, you weren't just improvising, you were remembering. Music lives in the body, in the heart. It remembers even when the mind forgets." Madison nodded once, quickly, then pushed through the door into the rain. Richard watched her disappear into the crowd of evening pedestrians, and for the first time in 23 years, he allowed himself to believe that miracles might be possible. In her pocket, Madison's fingers found Richard's business card, and despite everything, she didn't throw it away. Madison walked through the rain for 40 minutes before she realized she'd been wandering in circles. Her mind felt like static, white noise punctuated by fragments of memory that refused to form coherent pictures. By the time she finally caught the L train home, her clothes were soaked through and her violin case felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light. Margaret sat at the table, still in her robe, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. She looked up when Madison walked in, and the relief that flooded her face was so profound it made Madison's chest ache. "Oh, thank God," Margaret breathed, standing quickly. "I was so worried. You never stay out this late without calling." "Sorry, Mom. I lost track of time." The lie tasted bitter in Madison's mouth, but she couldn't bring herself to tell the truth. Not yet. Not until she understood what the truth even was. Margaret moved to help Madison out of her wet jacket, fussing over her the way she always did. "You're soaked to the bone. Let me get you some dry clothes and make you some soup." "I'm fine, really, just tired." But Margaret was already bustling around the kitchen, pulling ingredients from cabinets with the purposeful energy of someone who needed to feel useful. Madison watched her adoptive mother's familiar movements, the way she added just a touch too much salt to everything, the way she hummed under her breath when she cooked, the way her whole body seemed to relax when she was taking care of someone else. "Mom?" Madison said suddenly. "Tell me about the day you adopted me." Margaret's hand froze halfway to the spice rack. "What brought this on?" "I was just thinking today about being little. Sometimes I have these weird dreams, and I wondered if they might be memories from before you adopted me." Margaret turned slowly, her face carefully neutral. "You know your birth mother died in childbirth, honey. There wouldn't be any memories from before. But what about the hospital? The people who took care of me before you came? You were only a few days old when I brought you home. Babies that young don't form memories." Madison nodded, but something in Margaret's tone didn't sit right. It was too careful, too rehearsed, like an answer she'd practiced. "Where did we live when I was really little?" "Before Chicago. Portland. I told you that. But I remember a house with yellow walls in the kitchen. Portland was an apartment, wasn't it?" Margaret's face went very pale. She turned back to the stove, stirring the soup with unnecessary vigor. "Children's memories are strange things, Madison. Sometimes they mix up dreams and reality, or combine different places into one." Madison wanted to push harder, but something in Margaret's posture, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hand trembled slightly as she stirred, made her stop. Instead, she excused herself to take a shower, leaving Margaret alone in the kitchen with her secrets. Under the hot water, Madison let herself cry for the first time since leaving the coffee shop. Everything she'd built her identity around was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop the collapse. Richard's words echoed in her mind. "Music lives in the body, in the heart. It remembers even when the mind forgets." After her shower, Madison found Margaret had left a bowl of soup and a grilled cheese sandwich on her nightstand, along with a note that said, "Sweet dreams, my darling girl." It was such a typical Margaret gesture, loving, nurturing, desperately trying to make everything better with food and kindness. But tonight, instead of comfort, the note brought fresh tears. If Richard was telling the truth, then this woman who'd loved her so completely had stolen her from her real father. The thought was too big, too devastating to hold in her mind for long. Madison pulled out her sketchbook and found herself drawing without conscious thought. Her hand moved across the page, creating familiar images. The man at the piano, the yellow kitchen, the house with the red door. But tonight, there were new details. A golden retriever sleeping by a fireplace, a music box on a nightstand, a mobile hanging over a crib with little stars that caught the light. She was so absorbed in her drawing that she almost missed the sound of Margaret moving around in the next room. It was past midnight, but through the thin walls, Madison could hear drawers opening and closing, the soft sound of papers rustling. After 20 minutes, curiosity got the better of her. Madison crept to her bedroom door and peered out. Margaret's bedroom door was ajar, and she could see her adoptive mother kneeling beside her bed, pulling a small wooden box from underneath. Madison had never seen the box before. It was old-fashioned, the kind that might hold jewelry or important documents. Margaret opened the box with reverent care, and Madison caught a glimpse of photographs, papers, and what looked like a small piece of jewelry. Margaret lifted out one of the photographs and held it to the light, and Madison's blood turned to ice. Even from across the hallway, Madison could see that the photo showed a young child, a little girl with dark hair and green eyes who looked remarkably like Madison herself. But the child in the photo was wearing clothes Madison didn't recognize, standing in front of a house Madison had never seen, at least not in real life, except she had seen it, in her dreams, in her sketches, the red door, the white shutters, the garden full of roses. Margaret was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. She pulled out another item from the box, a small silver bracelet that caught the lamplight. Madison couldn't make out the details from her hiding spot, but something about it made her heart race. As quietly as possible, Madison retreated to her bed and lay staring at the ceiling until she heard Margaret put the box away and settle into sleep. Then she waited another hour before creeping out to the living room and pulling Richard's business card from her jacket pocket. His hotel answered on the second ring, and within minutes, she heard his sleep-roughened voice. "Hello? It's Madison. I need to see you tonight." There was a pause, then Richard's voice, fully alert now. "Are you all right? Where are you?" "I'm at home, but I can meet you somewhere. I found something. I think Margaret has been lying to me about everything. Where do you want to meet?" "The coffee shop where we talked earlier. They're open 24 hours. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Madison hung up and left a note for Margaret saying she couldn't sleep and had gone for a walk. It was thin as excuses went, but it was better than disappearing without a word. The coffee shop was nearly empty at 1 a.m. Just a night shift worker reading a paperback novel behind the counter. Richard was already there when Madison arrived, sitting in the same booth they'd occupied earlier. He looked like he'd thrown on clothes hastily. His hair was mussed and his shirt was wrinkled, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "What happened?" he asked as soon as she sat down. Madison told him about the box, about the photographs and the bracelet, about the way Margaret had looked at them like they were precious relics. As she spoke, Richard's expression grew increasingly grim. "Madison," he said when she finished, "I think it's time you knew the whole truth. About who Margaret really is, and how she came to have you. You know who she is?" Richard nodded slowly. "I've been making some calls since we talked earlier. Margaret Doyle worked as a nurse at Manhattan General Hospital from 1998 to 2001. She was on duty the night you were born." Madison felt the blood drain from her face. "She knew my parents. She knew me. And she knew your mother." Richard's voice was very quiet. "Madison, I don't think Margaret found you through an adoption agency. I think she took you from Central Park that day. I think she's the reason you disappeared." The words hit Madison like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table, feeling like the floor was tilting underneath her. "That's impossible. She loves me. She's devoted her whole life to me. I don't doubt that she loves you," Richard said gently. "But love can make people do terrible things, and sometimes the people who seem the most devoted are the ones with the most to hide." Madison stared at him, her mind reeling. Everything made sense now. Margaret's overprotectiveness, her reluctance to talk about the past, the way she'd always seemed almost afraid that someone might take Madison away from her. "What do I do?" Madison whispered. "We need proof," Richard said. "Real evidence, and we need to be very careful. If Margaret realizes we're investigating her, there's no telling what she might do." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets were still dark and wet, reflecting the neon signs of late-night businesses like broken promises. Madison thought about Margaret sleeping in the next room, probably dreaming peaceful dreams about her daughter coming home safely. Her daughter, the daughter she'd stolen. "She has photos," Madison said suddenly. "In that box, photos of me as a child that I don't remember taking." Richard leaned forward. "Could you get them?" "Maybe, but if she catches me, we'll figure it out together," Richard said. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." For the first time since walking into the coffee shop hours earlier, Madison felt something like hope. It was terrifying and painful, and completely overwhelming, but it was hope nonetheless. Somewhere across the city, Margaret Doyle woke from a nightmare about losing her daughter and reached across the hall to Madison's empty room, her heart stopping when she found nothing but cold sheets and silence. Madison returned home at dawn to find Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, still in her nightgown, clutching a cup of coffee with white knuckles. The note Madison had left lay crumpled beside her elbow, and her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and worry. "Where were you?" Margaret's voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying. "I told you I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk. For 5 hours." Margaret stood up, and Madison was startled by how frail she looked. In the gray morning light filtering through the kitchen windows, Margaret seemed to have aged a decade overnight. "Madison, please. Talk to me. What's going on?" Madison poured herself coffee, buying time while she figured out how to navigate this conversation. Richard's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "We need to be very careful. I've been having those dreams again," Madison said finally. "The ones about the man at the piano? They're getting more vivid." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee. "Dreams are just dreams, honey. They don't mean anything. But what if they're not dreams? What if they're memories? That's impossible. You know your history. Your birth mother died when you were born, and I adopted you when you were just days old." Madison watched Margaret's face carefully as she spoke. There, a tiny muscle twitching at the corner of her eye, the way her gaze slipped to the left when she mentioned the adoption. After 26 years of living with someone, you learn to read their tells. "Mom," Madison said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Margaret went very still. "Of course. Did you know my birth parents?" The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Outside, Chicago was waking up. Garbage trucks rumbling down the street, someone starting a car, the distant sound of the L train carrying early commuters to work. But inside their small kitchen, time seemed suspended. "Why would you ask that?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Because sometimes I remember things. A house with yellow kitchen walls, a golden retriever named Mozart, a man playing piano, and sometimes..." Madison paused, watching Margaret's face grow paler with each detail. "Sometimes I remember you. Not as my mother, but as someone else. Someone who used to come visit." Margaret's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. Neither of them moved to clean it up. "Madison, listen to me. Were you our babysitter?" Madison pressed on, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Is that how you knew me before?" Margaret's face crumpled, and she sank back into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at the broken pieces of ceramic scattered across the floor, like fragments of the life they'd built together. "I was a nurse," she said finally, her voice so quiet Madison had to strain to hear her. "At the hospital where you were born. I helped deliver you." The admission hit Madison like a physical blow. "You knew my father, Richard Whitman." "Yes, I knew him." Margaret's voice carried 26 years of buried pain. "He was never there." "Madison, he was always traveling, always putting his music before his family. Your mother, Sarah, she was sick, and he was off conducting some orchestra in Europe." Madison felt the room spinning around her. "My mother was sick. Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, but..." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She died when you were 4. Richard was devastated, but he still couldn't stay home. He hired nannies, babysitters, anyone who could watch you while he traveled. I was one of them. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that was both clearer and more devastating than anything Madison had imagined. You were our babysitter, and then you took me." Margaret looked up at her with eyes full of anguish and something that might have been relief. "You don't understand what it was like. Richard was gone 3 weeks out of every month. You were lonely, scared, confused about why your mother wasn't coming home. The nannies kept quitting because you'd cry for hours, asking for your mama. So you decided to steal me. I decided to save you." The words burst out of Margaret like a dam breaking. "You were wasting away in that big empty house, Madison. You'd lost so much weight the doctors were worried. You had nightmares every single night. And Richard, he'd call once a week if you were lucky. He cared more about his precious music than he did about his own daughter." Madison stared at her adoptive mother, her kidnapper, trying to reconcile this revelation with 26 years of love and devotion. "That didn't give you the right to take me." "Maybe not," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "But I loved you. From the moment I held you as a newborn. I loved you more than I'd ever loved anything in my life. I'd lost my own baby just weeks before you were born, a miscarriage at 8 months. And when I saw you, so perfect and beautiful, it felt like God was giving me another chance." Madison thought about Richard sitting alone in that coffee shop, gray-haired and broken, still searching for his lost daughter after 23 years. "He never stopped looking for me." "I know." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "I know he didn't." "The melody," Madison said suddenly. "The one I play. The one that comes to me in dreams. He wrote it for me when I was a baby. He's been playing it on the radio every week for 23 years, hoping I'd hear it someday." Margaret nodded, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. I heard it sometimes. When we lived in Portland, late at night, I'd catch it on the radio. That's how I knew he was still out there, still looking. Madison felt like she was drowning in information, in emotions too big and complex to process. Part of her wanted to comfort Margaret, to tell her it was okay, that she understood. But another part, a growing part, was furious at the life that had been stolen from her. The father who'd spent decades grieving a daughter who was alive and well and living 3 states away. I need some air, Madison said, standing abruptly. Madison, please don't go, let me explain. You've had 26 years to explain, Madison said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. I need time to think. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the door, pausing only when Margaret called her name. Madison? Margaret's voice was broken, desperate. Whatever happens, please remember that I love you. Everything I did because I love you. Madison looked back at the woman who'd raised her, who'd taught her to tie her shoes and helped her with homework and held her when she cried over broken hearts. Margaret Doyle, who'd committed the most terrible crime imaginable out of love. I know, Madison said softly. That's what makes this so hard. She left Margaret sitting in the kitchen surrounded by broken ceramic and broken dreams, and walked out into the bright Chicago morning where her real father was waiting in his hotel room for a phone call that would change all their lives forever. Madison pulled out her phone and dialed Richard's number with fingers that shook so badly she had to try 3 times. Richard, she said when he answered. It's me, Madison. We need to talk. Margaret just confessed everything. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Where are you? Walking toward downtown? Can you meet me at Millennium Park? By the Bean? I'll be there in 20 minutes. Madison hung up and continued walking, each step taking her further from the only mother she'd ever known, and closer to a father she was only beginning to remember, behind her, in the apartment they'd shared for so many years. Margaret Doyle sat alone among the ruins of the lie that had held their family together, finally understanding that love, no matter how deep or desperate, could not indefinitely hold back the truth. Richard found Madison sitting on a bench near Cloud Gate, staring at her distorted reflection in the polished steel surface. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone trying not to fall apart. Emily, the name slipped out before he could stop it. Madison turned, and Richard saw his own eyes looking back at him, the same gray-green that had stared back from mirrors his entire life. I think, she said carefully, I'm ready to hear you call me that. They walked through the park slowly, neither quite sure where to begin. Madison told him about Margaret's confession, about the hospital and the babysitting, and the terrible logic that had driven a grieving woman to steal a child. Richard listened without interrupting, his hands clenched in his jacket pockets. She really believed she was saving you, he said when Madison finished. Were you? Madison's question was direct, unflinching. Were you really that absent? That negligent? Richard stopped walking. The question hurt because it contained truth, the kind of truth he'd been running from for 23 years. Yes, he said simply. I was, after your mother died. I threw myself into work because I didn't know how to be a father without her. Sarah was the one who knew how to braid your hair and make pancakes shaped like butterflies. I just knew how to write music. But you would have learned. Maybe? I'd like to think so. But Margaret didn't give us the chance to find out. They sat on another bench overlooking the lake, watching joggers and dog walkers navigate the morning routine of a city waking up. Madison's phone had been buzzing constantly, texts from Margaret that she ignored. She's panicking, Madison said, glancing at the latest message. She wants me to come home so we can talk this through like a family. What do you want to do? Madison was quiet for a long time, watching the waves lap against the shore. I want to remember, she said finally. I want to remember what it felt like to be your daughter before she took that away from us. Richard felt something shift in his chest. A loosening of tension he'd carried for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Would you let me take you somewhere? There's a music store downtown, a good one. We could play together. Really play. Not just that one song. Madison nodded, but as they stood to leave, her phone rang, Margaret's name flashed on the screen. I should answer it, Madison said reluctantly. If I don't, she'll call the police and report me missing. Richard watched Madison's face change as she listened to whatever Margaret was saying. Her expression shifted from resignation to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. No, Mom. I'm fine. I need some space right now. A pause. What do you mean, dangerous? What are you talking about? Richard couldn't hear Margaret's words, but he could hear the tone. Sharp, urgent, desperate. Madison's eyes found his across the space between them, and he saw doubt creeping in. Mom, slow down. What research? What are you saying about him? Margaret's voice grew louder, and Richard caught fragments. Looked him up online. History of mental illness. Obsessed with his missing daughter. She's lying, Richard said quietly, but Madison held up a hand to silence him. I understand you're scared, Mom, but... Madison's face went pale. What do you mean you found articles about other women? What other women? Richard felt his stomach drop. He knew exactly what Margaret was referring to. The false leads over the years. The desperate investigations into young women who bore some resemblance to Emily. In the early years especially, he'd pursued every possibility with an intensity that had probably seemed unhinged to outside observers. Madison, he started, but she was already backing away from him. You approached other women, she asked, her voice small. Other women you thought might be Emily. It's not what it sounds like. How many? Richard closed his eyes. Over the years? Maybe a dozen. Maybe more. But Madison? That doesn't mean... Oh God. Madison's face was white now. Her free hand pressed to her chest. Mom, are you still there? Yes. I'm listening. Whatever Margaret was saying now was having a devastating effect. Madison's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Richard like she was seeing him for the first time. She says you had restraining orders filed against you, Madison whispered, that you stalked women, convinced they were Emily even when DNA tests proved they weren't. There was one restraining order, Richard said desperately. One, and it was a misunderstanding. The woman looked so much like Sarah, and I was going through a particularly bad period after the 10th anniversary. I made some poor choices, but I never hurt anyone. But Madison was shaking her head, stepping further away from him. How do I know what's real? How do I know you're not just another damaged man fixated on a fantasy? Margaret's voice through the phone was getting louder, more urgent. Richard could make out phrases now. Come home immediately. I'm scared for you. Don't trust him. Madison, please, Richard said. I know how this looks. But think about the music. Think about Lullaby for My Star. How could I have known that if you weren't really Emily? Maybe you researched it. Maybe you found old recordings somehow. Maybe this is just what you do. Find vulnerable young women and convince them they're your missing daughter. The words hit Richard like physical blows. He could see the doubt taking hold. Could see Margaret's poison working its way through Madison's mind like smoke. I have proof, he said desperately. Photos, medical records, DNA. DNA can be faked. Photos can be manipulated. Madison was crying now, backing toward the street. I don't know what to believe anymore. Emily, please, don't call me that. The shout drew stares from other park visitors. My name is Madison Cooper, and I'm going home to my mother. She turned and ran, leaving Richard standing alone by the lake with his heart breaking all over again. He pulled out his phone and called the private investigator he'd worked with over the years. Jack, it's Richard. I need everything you can find on Margaret Doyle, and I need it fast. She's poisoning Emily against me, and I'm losing her all over again. Meanwhile, Madison was in a taxi heading home, listening to Margaret's voice through her phone's speaker as her adoptive mother painted a picture of Richard as an obsessed, mentally unstable man who'd been stalking young women for decades. The internet is full of stories about him, honey, Margaret was saying. Women who had to get restraining orders, police reports, even a psychiatric evaluation that recommended therapy for delusional thinking. Madison wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But the music, Mom. He knew the melody I've been dreaming about. Think about it, Madison. You've been playing that melody on street corners for years. He could have heard you before, recorded you, researched you. Men like him are very good at manipulation. They study their targets. By the time Madison reached home, Margaret had her thoroughly convinced that Richard Whitman was at best delusional and at worst dangerous. Margaret met her at the door with a cup of tea and an armful of printouts. Articles about Richard's failed investigations, court documents from the restraining order, excerpts from police reports that painted him as an obsessed man unable to accept his daughter's death. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Margaret said, holding Madison close. "I should have protected you from this. I should have known something like this might happen eventually." Madison let herself be held, let herself be comforted by the woman who'd raised her. But even as Margaret's familiar embrace soothed her fears, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that something still didn't fit. The music had been too perfect, too personal. Richard's pain had been too real. But that voice was growing quieter as Margaret continued to whisper reassurances, continued to paint Richard as a threat they'd narrowly escaped. And in a hotel room across town, Richard Whitman sat staring at his phone, waiting for a call that wouldn't come, watching his daughter slip away from him again, just when he'd thought she was finally coming home. 3 days passed without contact from Madison. Richard paced his hotel room like a caged animal, his phone permanently attached to his hand, checking for messages that never came. Jack Morrison, his private investigator, had compiled a thick file on Margaret Doyle that painted a disturbing picture of a woman whose obsession with Emily had started long before the kidnapping. "Look at this," Jack said, spreading photographs across Richard's hotel room desk. They were surveillance photos taken outside Richard's house in Westchester 24 years ago. "I found these in the police files from right after Emily disappeared. They thought they were random paparazzi shots, but look closer." Richard studied the images. In the background of several photos, partially obscured by trees, was a woman with graying hair watching the house. The same woman in photo after photo, always at a distance, always watching. "That's Margaret," Richard said, his voice hollow. "She was stalking us even before she took Emily." "Gets worse," Jack said, pulling out a manila folder. "I talked to some of her former colleagues at Manhattan General. Apparently, she had what they called an unhealthy attachment to certain patients' babies. There were complaints, but nothing ever official. And get this, she'd lost a baby of her own just weeks before Emily was born. Full-term stillbirth." Richard sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Margaret's deception. "She's had 23 years to perfect her story, to convince Emily that I'm the dangerous one. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret was discovering that paranoia could be more exhausting than she'd anticipated. She hadn't slept properly in 3 days, jumping at every car door that slammed in the street, every footstep in the hallway. Madison had been unusually quiet since the confrontation with Richard, spending long hours in her room sketching or staring out the window with an expression Margaret couldn't read. "Are you feeling better today, honey?" Margaret asked over breakfast, trying to keep her voice light. Madison looked up from her untouched cereal. "I keep thinking about the music." Margaret's hand tightened around her coffee mug. "What about it?" He knew it perfectly. Every note, every variation I've been playing. How could he know that if he was just some obsessed stranger? "I told you. Men like him are very good at research. He probably recorded you playing on the street and studied the melody. But why would he choose me specifically, out of all the young women in Chicago? Why me?" Margaret had been dreading this question for 3 days. "Maybe because you're a musician. Maybe because you're the right age. Predators look for vulnerability, Madison. You're a beautiful young woman living on the margins, supporting yourself by playing music on street corners. You were an easy target." Madison nodded, but Margaret could see the doubt lingering in her green eyes. Those eyes that looked so much like Richard's. It sometimes took Margaret's breath away. "I think I'd like to go back to New York," Margaret said suddenly. "Visit some old friends. Maybe look at apartments. Chicago feels unsafe right now." "You want to move?" Madison looked surprised. "We've lived here for 20 years. Mom, sometimes a fresh start is exactly what we need." Margaret's mind was racing ahead, planning. If Richard was going to keep pursuing them, they needed to disappear again. She'd done it once. She could do it again. "We could go next week. Just a quick trip to test the waters." But even as she spoke, Margaret knew it wouldn't be that simple this time. Madison was 26 now, not 3. She had her own life, her own opinions, her own questions, and those questions were getting harder to answer. That afternoon, while Madison was out grocery shopping, Margaret made a decision that would have terrified her if she'd let herself think about it too carefully. She took a bus to a gun shop in a neighborhood where no one would recognize her, and, using identification she'd kept hidden for 23 years under the name Margaret Walsh, purchased a small handgun and ammunition. The clerk barely looked at her. Just another older woman who wanted protection in a dangerous world. He probably sold dozens of guns every week to people exactly like her. People who were afraid. People who felt cornered. People who would do anything to protect what they loved most. Margaret had never owned a gun before, had always been opposed to them in principle, but desperation had a way of changing your principles. If Richard Whitman thought he could take her daughter away from her after 23 years, he was going to discover just how far a mother would go to protect her child. She stopped at a hardware store on the way home and bought other supplies, items that, individually, seemed innocent enough. Fertilizer for the garden she didn't have, cleaning supplies for spring cleaning that wasn't scheduled, a timer for cooking meals that were getting simpler every day as her appetite disappeared. Margaret had never considered herself a violent person, but she'd also never been threatened with losing the only thing that gave her life meaning. Madison was hers, had been hers since that terrible day in Central Park, when she'd seen a little girl crying for her absent father, and decided that some children deserved better than the parents they'd been given. That evening, while Madison practiced violin in her room, Margaret sat at her kitchen table carefully reading instructions she'd found online. The internet was full of dangerous information if you knew where to look, and Margaret had always been good at research. She worked slowly, methodically, the way she'd approached everything in her nursing career. Each component was prepared with surgical precision, each step double-checked against the instructions. This wasn't about hurting innocent people. This was about protecting her family from a man who wanted to destroy everything they'd built together. In her room, Madison played Lullaby for My Star over and over, each repetition bringing back fragments of memory that felt increasingly real, a man's hands guiding her small fingers across piano keys, a voice singing her to sleep that wasn't Margaret's, the smell of coffee and sheet music and something else, cologne, maybe, or aftershave. She pulled out her phone and stared at Richard's contact information. He'd sent 3 text messages over the past few days, each one shorter and more desperate than the last. The most recent one simply said, "Emily, please, just give me a chance to prove I'm telling the truth." Madison deleted the messages without responding, but she couldn't delete the growing certainty that Margaret's story didn't quite fit together. Too many pieces were missing. Too many details didn't align with the memories that were surfacing with increasing clarity. But every time she started to doubt Margaret's version of events, her adoptive mother would show her another article about Richard's failed investigations, another piece of evidence that painted him as an unstable man fixated on impossible reunions. In his hotel room, Richard was preparing for what he feared might be his last chance to reach his daughter. Tomorrow evening, the Chicago Symphony was holding a benefit concert for missing children. A cruel irony that wasn't lost on him. He'd arranged to be the guest conductor, and he'd managed to get Madison's name on the list of local musicians invited to perform. It was a desperate gambit, but Richard was a desperate man. If he could get Madison in the same room, if he could play Lullaby for My Star, with a full orchestra behind him, maybe the music would be powerful enough to break through Margaret's web of lies. He didn't know that Margaret had already discovered his plan through a friend who worked at the symphony office. He didn't know that she was, at that very moment, sitting in her kitchen with a device that would ensure Richard Whitman never conducted another concert, never played another note, never threatened her family again. Margaret looked at her creation with a mixture of pride and terror. Such a simple thing. Really, a timer, some carefully mixed chemicals, a few wires connected just so. But effective, more than effective enough to solve her Richard problem permanently. She just had to get Madison to that concert. The Chicago Symphony Center glowed against the evening sky like a beacon, its glass facade reflecting the city lights in fractured patterns that reminded Madison of her mother's broken coffee cup. She stood across the street, violin case in hand, watching well-dressed patrons stream through the entrance to the benefit concert for missing children. Margaret stood beside her, unnaturally calm for someone who'd been a bundle of nerves all week. She'd insisted on coming to the concert, claiming she wanted to support Madison's performance. But something in her demeanor felt off, too controlled, too purposeful. "Are you sure about this, honey?" Margaret asked, her hand resting on Madison's shoulder with what felt like unusual weight. "You know he'll be there, Richard Whitman. He's conducting tonight." Madison had known. The invitation had specified that the guest conductor would be the renowned Richard Whitman. And for the past 3 days, she'd wrestled with whether to attend. Part of her wanted to run as far as possible from the man who claimed to be her father. But another part, the part that woke up every morning humming melodies she'd never consciously learned, needed to hear him conduct. "I can handle it," Madison said, though her voice shook slightly. "It's just music." Margaret's smile was thin. "Of course it is, darling. Just music." They crossed the street together, Margaret's hand never leaving Madison's back, as if she were steering her toward something inevitable. In her purse, Margaret carried more than just lipstick and tissues. The weight of the gun pressed against her hip with each step, and in her coat pocket, her fingers found the small device she'd spent the previous evening perfecting. The theater was magnificent, all red velvet and gold leaf, with crystal chandeliers that cast everything in warm, honey-colored light. Madison had performed in smaller venues around the city, but never anything like this. The stage seemed enormous from the audience, and the seats were filled with Chicago's cultural elite, all gathered to support families like Richard's, families whose children had simply vanished. Margaret had purchased seats in the 3rd row, close enough to see everything clearly. As they settled in, Madison spotted Richard at the side of the stage, speaking quietly with the concertmaster. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands moved restlessly as he spoke. "He looks nervous," Madison observed. "He should be," Margaret said quietly, her eyes never leaving Richard's figure. "This is probably his last chance." There was something in Margaret's tone that made Madison look at her more closely. Her adoptive mother's face was serene, almost peaceful, but her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Tonight ends everything, one way or another." The lights dimmed before Madison could ask what she meant. Richard walked onto the stage to polite applause, and Madison felt her breath catch as she saw him clearly for the first time since their confrontation in the park. He looked older, more fragile, but when he raised his baton, something in his bearing changed. This was his domain, his element. The first piece was Barber's Adagio for strings, haunting and beautiful and perfect for a concert dedicated to loss. As the music swelled, Madison found herself transported. She'd heard recordings, of course, but experiencing it live was different. The music didn't just fill the air, it filled her chest, her bones, her memory. Intermission came too quickly. Madison was scheduled to perform during the second half, a solo piece chosen specifically for its emotional impact. As the lights came up, she noticed Margaret reaching into her coat pocket, her fingers working at something Madison couldn't see. "I need to use the restroom," Margaret said, standing abruptly. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Madison nodded, still lost in the aftermath of the music. She watched Margaret make her way up the aisle. Moving with the purposeful stride of someone with a specific destination in mind, Margaret didn't go to the restroom. Instead, she found a maintenance door that led to the backstage area, a door she'd propped open earlier when she'd arrived for her pre-concert reconnaissance. The device in her pocket was small, but sophisticated. Timer set for 27 minutes. Enough time to get Madison safely outside, but not enough time for Richard to escape what was coming. She'd planned this carefully. The device would be placed near the electrical panel that controlled the stage lighting. When it detonated, it would look like an electrical fire. Tragic, but accidental. Richard would be conducting when it happened, standing directly in the blast radius. The musicians would have time to evacuate, but Richard, dedicated to his art until the end, would likely try to ensure everyone else got out safely first. He wouldn't survive his own heroism. Margaret found the electrical panel exactly where the maintenance worker she'd bribed had told her it would be. Her hands were steady as she attached the device, 30 years of nursing, having taught her to function under pressure. The timer began its silent countdown. 26:47, 26:46, 26:45. She was back in her seat with 2 minutes to spare before the second half began. Madison was exactly where she'd left her, reading through her sheet music with the focused concentration of a true musician. "Everything okay?" Madison asked without looking up. "Perfect," Margaret said, settling back into her seat. "Everything's going exactly as planned." The second half opened with Madison's solo, a piece called Searching. which she'd chosen for its technical challenges and emotional depth. As she walked onto the stage, Madison felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, but her focus narrowed to the music, to the feeling of the violin against her shoulder, to the familiar comfort of making something beautiful from nothing. She began to play, and the melody that emerged was haunting in its familiarity. Not searching at all, but something else, something that came from deeper than conscious thought. Lullaby for my star. In the wings, Richard felt his knees go weak as Emily's melody filled the concert hall. Not the simple version he'd written 26 years ago, but a mature, complex interpretation that spoke of loss and longing, and the terrible beauty of love that endures beyond reason. Margaret's face went white as she recognized the melody. This wasn't the piece Madison had rehearsed. This wasn't the piece on the program. This was the song that had haunted their household for 26 years. The melody that had followed them from Portland to Chicago like a persistent ghost, as Madison played. Something extraordinary happened. The memories she'd been fighting began to surface not as fragments, but as complete scenes. She was 3 years old again, sitting on a piano bench next to a man with gentle hands and sad eyes. He was teaching her to play this melody, guiding her small fingers across the keys while he sang softly about stars and dreams and love that never dies. "Daddy," she whispered, the word lost in the music but heard by her heart. The violin sang with 23 years of separation, with a father's endless grief and a daughter's unconscious longing. The melody built and swelled, incorporating every variation Madison had ever dreamed, every harmony she'd discovered in her sleep. In the audience, people were crying. This wasn't just a performance. It was a revelation, a homecoming, a miracle set to music. Margaret looked at her watch. 4:23 left on the timer. She stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. "We need to leave," she hissed to Madison. "Now." But Madison was lost in the music. Lost in the memories flooding back like water through a broken dam, she remembered everything now. Her father's cologne, her mother's lullabies, the golden retriever who slept at the foot of her bed, the music box that played for Elise. She remembered being taken. Margaret was moving toward the aisle when Madison's music stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Madison's voice rang out clear and strong. "I remember you." She was looking directly at Richard, her violin lowering to her side. "I remember all of it. The house with yellow walls, Mozart sleeping on my bed, you teaching me to play piano. I remember being taken." Margaret froze in the aisle as hundreds of faces turned toward her. On stage, Madison continued speaking, her voice carrying to every corner of the theater. "Her name is Margaret Doyle. She was our babysitter. She took me from Central Park 23 years ago." The theater erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, the sound of people rising from their seats. But through it all, Margaret heard something else. The soft, insistent beeping of a timer with 3 minutes and 47 seconds remaining. She reached into her coat pocket, her finger finding the abort switch, but stopped as her eyes met Madison's across the theater. Her daughter, her Emily, her Madison, was looking at her not with hatred, but with something that looked like pity. "I know you love me," Madison said, her voice somehow carrying over the chaos. "But love isn't supposed to hurt this much." Margaret's finger hovered over the switch that would stop the timer, stop the plan, stop everything. Around her, theater security was moving. People were shouting. Chaos was spreading like wildfire. But all Margaret could see was the daughter she'd raised, the child she'd loved more than her own life, looking at her with eyes full of forgiveness and sorrow. Time seemed suspended in the concert hall as Margaret stood frozen in the aisle, her finger hovering over the abort switch. 3 minutes and 26 seconds on the timer. Around her, security guards were pushing through the crowd, but they seemed to move in slow motion. Madison set down her violin and walked to the edge of the stage, never breaking eye contact with the woman who had raised her. "Stop this, Mom. Whatever you're planning, just stop." Margaret's hand trembled in her coat pocket. How could Madison know? How could she possibly? "I can see it in your eyes," Madison continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 26 years reading Margaret's every expression. "You have that look you get when you're trying to protect me from something. But I don't need protecting anymore. Not from him, and not from the truth." Richard stepped forward from the wings, his hands raised peacefully. "Margaret, please. Whatever you're thinking of doing, it won't solve anything. It won't bring back your baby, and it won't keep Emily from knowing who she really is." At the mention of her lost child, Margaret's composure finally cracked. The tears she'd been holding back for 23 years spilled over, and her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible, but somehow carrying through the theater's acoustics. "I lost everything. My baby, my husband, my reason for living. And then Emily came along, and she needed me. She needed me when you weren't there." "I know," Richard said, walking slowly down the aisle toward her. "And I know you saved her in ways I never could have. Look at her, Margaret. Look at what you helped her become." Madison had climbed down from the stage and was moving toward them both, her face streaked with tears, but determined. "You gave me music," she said to Margaret. "You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me love when I was lost. That's real." "Mom, that's not going away." 2 minutes and 43 seconds. Margaret's finger pressed against the abort switch, but she couldn't make herself activate it. The weight of what she'd almost done, what she was still planning to do, crushed down on her like a physical force. "I can't lose you," she whispered. "You're all I have. You're not losing me," Madison said, reaching the aisle now, just 10 feet away. "But I need to know where I come from. I need to understand the whole story, not just the part that started when I was 3. Security guards were closer now, speaking into radios, coordinating what was clearly going to be an arrest. Margaret could see them in her peripheral vision, but her focus remained locked on Madison's face. "The device," Margaret said suddenly. "I have to—" She pulled her hand from her pocket, revealing a small black remote with a red button. 2 minutes, maybe less. The theater erupted in fresh chaos as people realized what Margaret was holding. Shouts of "bomb" and "evacuate" filled the air, but Madison stepped closer instead of running. "Where is it?" Madison asked calmly. "Backstage near the electrical panel. I thought if Richard was gone, we could disappear again, start over somewhere new." Richard felt ice in his veins, but he kept his voice steady. "Margaret, hit the button, stop the timer. I don't know if it will work. I built it, but I've never tested the abort function." Madison was close enough to touch Margaret now. Without hesitation, she pulled the older woman into her arms, holding her tight. "Then we'll face whatever happens together, the way we always have." Margaret's finger found the abort button and pressed it firmly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small green light appeared on the device, and Margaret sagged with relief. "It's stopped," she whispered. "It's over." Security reached them then, but Margaret didn't resist as they took the device and placed her in handcuffs. She looked at Madison one last time, memorizing her face. "I love you," she said simply. "Whatever happens next, remember that everything I did came from love." "I know," Madison replied, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too." As Margaret was led away, she passed Richard in the aisle. She stopped, looking up at him with eyes that held 23 years of justified fear and unjustifiable choices. "Take care of her," she said quietly. "She's stronger than you know, but she's also more fragile than she pretends to be. She needs music the way other people need air." Richard nodded, his own eyes wet. "I will. And Margaret, thank you for loving her when I couldn't, for keeping her safe when I failed to." Margaret's smile was sad but genuine. She was easy to love. The theater slowly emptied as bomb disposal experts swept the building, but Richard and Madison remained, sitting together in the front row. The stage where Madison had just reclaimed her identity stretched before them, empty now but somehow still humming with the resonance of revelation. "How much do you remember?" Richard asked gently. "Most of it now. It's like the music unlocked everything at once." Madison wiped her eyes with a tissue from her violin case. "I remember Mom, Sarah, singing to me when I was sick. I remember you teaching me to play Happy Birthday on the piano for my 3rd birthday. I remember the day she took me, the confusion, the fear, the way Margaret kept telling me we were going to a better place." Richard reached for her hand, then stopped himself. "May I?" Madison nodded, and Richard gently took her fingers in his. Her hands were musician's hands now, calloused from violin strings, strong and sure. Not the tiny fingers he remembered guiding across piano keys, but unmistakably connected to that lost little girl. What happens now? Madison asked. I don't know, Richard admitted. There will be legal proceedings. Margaret will probably face serious charges, and he paused, searching for the right words. We have 23 years to catch up on. I'd like that, Madison said. But I want to keep my name Madison. It's who I've been for most of my life. Madison Emily Whitman, Richard suggested. Best of both worlds. Madison smiled. The first real smile Richard had seen from her. I like that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the cleanup crews work around them. Finally, Madison spoke again. I want to visit her, Margaret, when they'll let me. Richard felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, but he pushed it down. Of course, she's your mother too, in all the ways that matter. And I want to learn about Sarah, my birth mother. I don't remember much about her. She would have loved the woman you've become, Richard said. She always said you had music in your soul, even as a baby, when she was sick. She used to ask me to play Lullaby for my star, because it was the only thing that would make you stop crying. Madison leaned against Richard's shoulder, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Play it for me, she said. The real version. All of it. Richard looked at the grand piano on the stage. Are you sure? I'm sure. They walked onto the stage together, and Richard sat at the piano bench while Madison stood beside him with her violin. The theater was nearly empty now, just a few security guards and cleanup crew members, but it felt intimate rather than abandoned. Richard began to play, and the melody that emerged was different from any version Madison had heard before. This was the original, simple, pure, written by a young father who'd believed the future held nothing but joy for his small family. Madison joined in with her violin, and together they created something new. The melody evolved as they played, incorporating Madison's street musician techniques and Richard's classical training. Sarah's remembered lullabies and Margaret's desperate love, 23 years of separation and the miracle of reunion. When the last note faded, they sat in perfect silence. Outside, Chicago continued its endless rhythm, but inside the concert hall, time felt suspended again. Not in crisis this time, but in peace. 6 months later, Madison Emily Whitman performed regularly with the Chicago Symphony while maintaining her weekly performances on the streets. Richard had established the Emily Song Foundation, providing support for families of missing children and music therapy for trauma survivors. Every Tuesday, Madison visited Margaret at the psychiatric facility where she was serving her sentence. They talked about music, about memories, about forgiveness, and the complicated geography of love. And every Tuesday night, Richard continued his radio show, but now Lullaby for My Star was accompanied by Madison's violin, broadcast live from wherever in the world their concert schedule had taken them. The song had found its way home, and in doing so, had become a beacon for other lost souls searching for their own impossible reunions. Love, they had learned, was more complex than they had ever imagined, capable of terrible crimes and infinite forgiveness, of creating families and tearing them apart, of surviving decades of separation and blooming again in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The music played on,